Hello, welcome or welcome back. My name is Ari and today we are going to go over my 1960s TBR. Now, with all of my Century Reading Challenge TBR videos, I start out with a history lesson. Maybe you'll learn something. Maybe you already know all of the stuff that I'm going to cover. I want to go over what happened in the 1960s, so it kind of makes sense like what the literature of the time is primarily going to be about based off of the global climate of the decade. Shit went down in the 1960s. Like, shit went down. People basically decided that they were sick of the nuclear family with the straight white man who works, his beautiful white wife who stays at home, and their 2.5 kids. No. That was the 1950s. We're done with that shit now. There was a cultural revolution, if you didn't catch that. For the first decade ever, girls were showing their knees. Those slutty knees came out to play with the invention of mini skirts. It was really like everything that was the norm in the 1950s, it's the exact opposite in the 1960s. People are sick of this cis white shit. As far as the global political stage, there is a huge confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. There was like a constant threat of nuclear war still going on, and then the space race. The first man landed on the moon in 1969. John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And I need you all to sit here and pause for a moment and realize that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in the 1960s. I'm guessing a lot of your parents were probably born in the 60s or 70s. Like, the civil rights movement is not something that happened before everybody alive was born. Like, a lot of people lived through this who are still living today. There's this thing called counterculture that I've kind of been talking about. We today know about it as hippies, but it's the culture of the 1950s countered. So no more business suits. Let's use a lot of drugs, let's wear some short skirts and be free and be happy. And it's not a corporation, and it's not about capitalism, it's about nature. So counterculture. The anti-Vietnam War movement was kind of a mix of counterculture, and you also saw it with the civil rights movement. Like, people are sick of all of these wars that the government is like throwing them into for no fucking reason at all. Like, why was the US at war with Vietnam at all? Like, what's the point? No more wars. Then of course the civil rights movement, which I've already talked about. People of color were fucking sick of being told that they are lesser beings, that they don't have the same rights as white people, and there was a movement. There's a movement again going on right now that's this same old shit. And you know what? African Americans were not the only group of people having a civil rights movement. There was also this Hispanic and Chicano movement. Why was that so hard to say? The Hispanic and Chicano movements, where people from Latin America were trying to get rights to be treated like human beings white people aren't the only people. I know, it's a shocker. And since we're fighting for civil rights, let's also go with the second wave feminist movement that happened in the 1960s. People were really sick of white cis men in the 1960s. Like, super, super sick of white cis men in the 1960s. Oh, one more movement that I forgot about. The gay rights movement of the 1960s. People were real sick of white cis men in the 1960s. Does any of this sound familiar? Like, I feel like we're kind of repeating the 1960s right now. Raise your hand if you feel the same. Actually, raise your hand in the comment box below that this is like eerily familiar. Like, this is why we learn history, so we don't repeat the same stupid shit over and over again and have to keep having major movements telling the government and the white cis men who run the government to fuck off, that everybody else has rights too. As far as literature, most of the literature had to do with the previous movements that I just spoke about, so it's not shocking to anybody. There's a lot of feminist literature, there's a lot of POC literature, there's starting to be gay literature, but that movement doesn't really gain as much ground until the 90s and even further beyond that. There is a lot of counterculture literature, literature about drugs, about sex. One of the major literature movements in the 1960s was blurring the lines between fact and fiction. So this is where, like, there are a lot of non-fiction being written that sound like they're fiction, and a lot of fiction being written that sounds like it's non-fiction. There's also like a fabulism movement in literature where things are being written that are like metaphysical but funny. Like, one of the examples given in this was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where it's a story about a mental hospital, but the employees of the mental hospital are like even crazier than the inmates of the mental hospital. So that kind of thing. Now that we've had our history lesson, let's go into my TBR. And I kind of did something different for this month's TBR where I let other people choose the books that I am reading for this. I originally started with a poll on Instagram in my Instagram stories, but no one voted on it. Like, not one single solitary person voted on it. So I took the polls to my Twitter, which has a significantly higher following than my Instagram. I have about just over 100 followers on Instagram the last time I checked, but I have like nearly 5,000 followers on Twitter. But my Twitter is a work Twitter. It's mostly video game related, and I don't post a whole lot about books on my Twitter account. It's just video games and work. So most of the people voting on these polls like don't read at all. And I've discovered that my Twitter following, that is predominantly men from the ages of 16 to 25, pick sci-fi almost every single time. Like, literally every single poll but one was a sci-fi novel that won, and the one that didn't win as a sci-fi novel ended up being like one vote off. In the back, the one less vote was a sci-fi novel. So almost sci-fi across the board. I don't particularly care for sci-fi, so fuck you, Twitter. I am going to go over each book that I am reading. plus the books that were part of the poll. There was only 6 of them that were part of a poll. 4 of these books I already owned, and I didn't want to like have to buy books that I don't own just to fill a reading prompt if they didn't win. So 4 of them I just picked. The other 6 Twitter picked, and I will put the Twitter poll up here after I tell you what books like were up for nomination, and you can see like the percentages and stuff like that. So for 1961, the options were Catch-22, Where the Red Ferns Grow, and James and the Giant Peach. And James and the Giant Peach by Roald Dahl won. As you can see, this is the one where it was 1 vote off, where Catch-22, which is a science fiction novel, was very, very close, but James and the Giant Peach did win this one. So that is what I'm reading for 1961. This is a children's book. It's really weird. It's kind of violent, if I remember correctly. Like, James' parents have died, and he goes to live with his aunts, and his aunts are really cruel to him, and if I remember correctly, it was like a magic something, like, it's not a beanstalk, but I want to say it's like a magic bean, like Jack and the Giant Beanstalk, but it grows a giant peach instead, and then he goes on an adventure in the giant peach. It's weird, but we'll get to that when I actually read it. For 1962, the poll consisted of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, A Clockwork Orange, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, and Something Wicked This Way Comes, and A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess won. I have not seen the movie of this, so I don't really know a whole lot about it. I do know it's about like very violent youth. I am not sure if it's like youth who are being violent to rebel against the older adult authorities, or if this is something written by an old man who's saying like youth are violent because they're privileged. So I don't know if this is like a boomer book talking about millennials or a millennial book talking about boomers, but we'll find out. We'll find out. 1963, I only had 2 book options for 1963, and they were Planet of the Apes and The Bell Jar. Planet of the Apes won, not surprising. I don't think a lot of people even know who Sylvia Plath is, as far as like my Twitter following goes. So I'm not really surprised at this one. I would have preferred to read The Bell Jar personally, but Twitter demands and we deliver. Planet of the Apes is a French novel by Pierre Boulle? I can't say French names. I am sorry for butchering your name, but it was translated into English, and it's basically a sci-fi novel where a couple of men are traveling in space trying to find a new planet to see if there's life on other planets, and they discover a planet where the apes are the intelligent species and humans are animal-like, and so it's kind of like a reversal of Earth, and then shit goes down. If it's anything like the movie, I know what the ending is, but I'm not gonna spoil it for you. For 1964, the options were mostly children's books and one sci-fi. I bet you'll never guess which one won. We've got Harriet the Spy, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and The Penultimate Truth. obviously the sci-fi one, which is the Penultimate Truth. If you know anything about video games, this is basically Fallout, like the Fallout universe as a book, where World War III has happened and these people go to an underground bunker to survive the fallout of the nuclear war. And if I understood the synopsis correctly, then there really isn't a war. Like, there's the threat of war, they go into the bunker, no actual war happens, but they think there's a war, and they're stuck underground in this bunker for years and years thinking that they're the only survivors when everything on the surface is all fine and dandy. 1965 is a book I already owned, but I guarantee you that Twitter would have picked this anyway because it's Dune. So 6 sci-fi books this month, and Dune is a chunker of a book. This is a gorgeous copy that I have with my sprayed edges, but I've never read Dune. It's a classic sci-fi, and apparently it's very polarizing. People either like love this book or they absolutely hate it and think it's trash. So let's hope that I love it, because this is really long and I don't want to read a long book that I hate. Next up, for 1966 is also a book I own. This is a reread. This is one of my all-time favorite books. I've read it probably, I don't know, 30 times at this point, and that is Valley of the Dolls by Jacqueline Susann. This book covers 3 women who are famous in different ways. One is a model for like ads, like she's the face of a brand. One is a Broadway / movie star, and the other one is like a silent movie non-singing actress. So the Broadway star is a singing actress, and then the other one's like she's hot and she's an actress type of book. They all deal with a bunch of different shit and start taking dolls, which are pills, to cope with their lives. And it deals with addiction, it deals with the overbearing price of fame in some cases. It's good. I love it. It's depressing, but if y'all ain't new here, then you know that I love books with really, really depressing endings. Interestingly enough, this is a movie cover of the book. If you pull this away, you can see the actresses from the movie. This movie, first off, has a different ending than the book. I actually like the movie ending better, even though the movie ending is happier, and that's very abnormal for me. But this is the very, very last movie that Sharon Tate starred in before she was killed by the Manson family. So I highly recommend both the book and the movie. It's one of the few that I actually like both. 1967 rolls around and it's another book that I already owned, and that was 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This is translated from Spanish into English, so second translated book that I'm reading this month, I think. Yes, the other one was French. Second. There's another one that's not on this TBR that's translated from Swedish, so I'm reading 3 translated books this month that I know of. Anyway, back to this book. I've tried to read this before and I was bored, so hopefully now that I'm older I can get through this, I can understand it some more. I know a lot of people have a lot of issues understanding this because people have very similar names in it, and there are a lot of characters. This covers I believe, two separate families in South America. And it's kind of like 100 years in the families, I think. There's magical realism in here. That's all I know. That's all I know. Next up for 1968 is another poll. And this poll was for Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, The House of Dyes Dreer, and Coming of Age in Mississippi. Can you guess which book won? If you guessed the science fiction, you're right. And I am reading Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is the story that is the inspiration. This is the story that's the inspiration for Blade Runner, the Blade Runner movie. It's not an exact same story, but this inspired Blade Runner. And it's about a bounty hunter who is killing off androids because they were abnormally violent. I hope it's as weird as Blade Runner the movie is. I guess we'll find out. For 1969, it's another book that I already owned, and although I love Valley of the Dolls, I never realized that it was the first book in a trilogy. I had no idea at all, and so I picked up the second and third book in the trilogy, and for 1969 I am reading the second book, which is called The Love Machine. It didn't come with a cover, so this is kind of boring to hold up, but this apparently follows completely different characters, and maybe that's why I never knew it was part of the trilogy. It's because the first book has a very clear set ending that doesn't need a follow-up, and it doesn't have a direct follow-up. This follows completely different set of characters. From my understanding, this is about a man who is kind of a slut, and he sleeps around and he can't like settle on one woman. He's got like fear of commitment. So we'll see if I like this as much as Valley of the Dolls. And the third book in the series will be read in the 70s because it wasn't published until then. For 1970, and this is the last poll, the options were Ringworld, Deliverance, The Bluest Eye, and The Crystal Cave. Honestly, I wanted Deliverance to win because that's a really fucked up movie and I wanted some horror in my life. I also kind of wanted to read The Bluest Eye, which is by Toni Morrison. It was her first novel. So, but of course the science fiction won, so I'm reading Ringworld. This is about an alien spaceship, I guess, that is like a ring. And it's like a flat ring like this. And then the false gravity makes it where like people can live on like the inner side of the ring. And then there's like panels that float above, and those panels like go from like day to night. There's like spaces between them. And apparently it's like 3 times bigger than Earth. And a couple of scientists, I believe, crash land on this planet and realize that everybody who lives on this planet has been killed off, and it's all like in ruin and stuff like that, and they're trying to find a way to get off of this destroyed spaceship planet and get back to where they were going. I don't know where they were going, but they were going somewhere, crash landed, trying to get back off the planet. And that's it. That is my TBR for the 1960s. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.